Hi, I'm Eileen Farnood, and welcome back to another episode of the Plastic Shift podcast. Today I'm joined by Joana Prata, a PhD student in biology and ecology of global change in the University of Aveiro. Under the supervision of Dr. Teresa Rocha Santos, she is working on the development of analytic methodologies, sampling, and ecotoxicological testing of microplastics. Joana holds a master's degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Porto, Portugal. Her research interests focus on environmental health, and most precisely, on the impacts of environmental contaminants on animal and human health, as well as ecosystems. Joana has, so far, published 14 peer-reviewed papers in international ISI index journals, being the first author of 12, and she has presented 20 oral or poster communications in international conferences. So thank you so much for joining me today. Could you briefly explain your research regarding microplastics and describe what microplastics are for those who might not know?
Hello, Haylene. Thank you for having me in this podcast today. I started working on microplastics during my master's degree. I have a master's in veterinary medicine, but then decided to follow a more research-oriented field, and I went to toxicology, mostly focused on environmental pollutants. That's when I started working with microplastic. I think it was 2015, and I started testing microplastics on organisms, and then I had to move on to my PhD. And now I started developing a method to look for microplastics in the environment, because current methods were not very easy to implement. And also because I needed to know how many microplastics were in the environment before testing them on organisms. So now I am moving on to the phase where I'm doing some sampling. I already have some data on how many there are in the environment. And then I can go on to test on fish and other organisms. I mostly focus on the aquatic environment, but I have also worked with other kind of samples. Microplastics are very small pieces of plastic. They are under 5 millimeters in size. So if you go to the beach, you can actually find them, mostly on the water line by the sea line, where you see the algae and all that debris. You can also find the microplastics, but they can be very, very small. So small you cannot see them with your bare eyes. So that's why I'm trying to develop these techniques to go smaller.
Mm-hmm. And which aspects of the environment have you been researching? I know you say you focus on aquatic, but have you also been looking into like airborne microplastics as well?
Yes, we have some projects on airborne microplastics. Last year, we had a master's student working with me. She worked on airborne microplastics. However, we had some trouble because they are very difficult to sample, because since they are in the air, when you're working the sample, they are also in the air of the laboratory. So it's easy for them to contaminate everything. So we've been developing these methods to not have any contamination, because plastics are everywhere. They release from our clothes, they release from the objects. Like most of our objects are plastic, so it's almost impossible to contain them. But yes, now we have another master student. In this first master's, we developed a method, and now in this second master, we are actually sampling the air. The problem is we had to stop because of the current pandemic, but we hope to start again in September maybe.
Mm-hmm. And based off of your research so far, have you been able to quantify the amount of microplastics? I know this has been a huge task that a lot of people are working on, but if you were to give an estimate of how much microplastics are present in the ocean or in the air, what would you say?
I am not really sure. I know I was now currently working on a paper. I will try to publish soon. And in this paper, we could go down to 2 micrometers in size. It's very small. It's even smaller than a strand of hair. And these very, very small microplastics are more abundant than the big ones. And most people only look at the big microplastics like 1 millimeter, sometimes half a millimeter. You can still see them by the eye. And most people look at these, but I'm going down with the smaller sizes, and I am seeing that smaller sizes are way more abundant than the bigger ones. And in this work, I found about 200 microplastics per liter in a river near a city here in
Wow.
Portugal. So it's a lot of microplastics.
Mm-hmm. And so far, like, what have you found to be like the biggest source of these microplastics? Like, where are they coming from?
We're not really sure yet because we don't have a lot of research on that specifically, but we have a lot of hypotheses. In this work I was talking about, I was actually exploring some sources of microplastics in the river, and we found that, as we expected, that a boat dock and a boat repair shop, the places in the river near this, are actually way more polluted than rural areas in the countryside upriver, and also near wastewater effluents. It's actually also bigger because when we use water, wash our clothes, all that goes in the sewage, and the sewage is way contaminated with microplastics because most of our textiles are fibers, and cosmetics also contain plastics. So yeah, at least those two sources are known, but it can be anything, even cars and anything that has some kind of abrasion and is made of plastic can release microplastics. So there's a lot of sources.
Mm-hmm. And I was personally really surprised when I was looking a little bit into this, and I realized just how much microplastics were present both in the water and in the air. So, like, so far in your research, like, what have you looked into sort of the impacts on human health? And if so, have you been able to determine some of the effects of microplastics if we were to ingest it?
So far, the research on human health is very limited because, well, usually research on human health is focused on in vivo studies. It means on cells in plates, which
Mm-hmm.
is not completely representative of a body, and also on animals like rats that we can extrapolate. But so far, it's been very limited, the research done in both of these. It seems that microplastics, if they have an effect, it's usually causing inflammation or um, through oxidative stress, because they can induce the production of free radicals that can interact with the other molecules and damage them. But well, this is only shown on specific laboratory conditions that usually expose organisms to very high concentrations. Research, we have been looking at this, trying to piece all together because we also do not have the time nor the people to do all the research, but we have been reading a lot about this, and also following the European Union guidelines, and they released the reports some months ago about human health, and they say that so far there is no evidence for direct damage of microplastics in human health. But that does not mean they cannot have indirect effects and also chronic effects, because if you're exposed for a lifetime, we don't know what it can do.
Mm-hmm. So far, have microplastics been like more impactful on organisms as opposed to humans?
I'm not sure if they're more impactful on organisms. We have this problem that I was talking about in the beginning, that most people do not quantify all microplastics. There's a lot of methods. We don't know what we're quantifying, if it's right or not. So we cannot determine exposure. And also, besides this, we have people on the laboratory filling the animals with microplastics. And then, of course, they will have some effects. But if you, it's so much microplastics, you cannot extrapolate to the environmental conditions. So I think organisms directly are probably not impacted right now unless they are in hotspots of microplastics, the sources you talked about, near these big sources of plastics.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they have different effects on the ecosystem because they can change the properties of soil or beach sediment, and that can have an impact on organisms as well. Also, there are bacteria and viruses that only live on the surface of microplastics. So this could also change the dynamics of populations and even transport some pathogenic organisms across the ocean. So there's still a lot to be seen besides direct toxicity. So I don't know. I think we should be careful because they accumulate in the environment in very high concentrations because they are persistent, they do not go away, and we cannot get them back. So this is a big problem because eventually they will have effects. And when they do, it will be too late. That is why we need to work on solutions.
Mm-hmm. You just said we will not get them back. So do you think that there aren't really, are there any methods in place used to like remove microplastics from the environment, or are they just too small that we can't really do anything about it at this point?
Well, there are two types of microplastic. I think it's good if we talk a little bit about this because there are the primary microplastics where we produce them in this small size on purpose and then use them on industry or cosmetics and so on. They already have these tiny sizes. And then we have the secondary microplastics. These are thought to be also the most abundant, and they basically fragment from bigger plastics. They do not degrade, but they break down into smaller pieces. And these we can prevent by removing the plastics in the environment, the big ones, right? If we remove the big one, it won't fragment into smaller ones.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like 5 millimeters, this is already a microplastic. Maybe you can collect them back. Some of them, at least, like in beaches and other places where they accumulate. But you won't be able to get them. They are everywhere. I don't know if you've seen the research, but they are in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, sometimes even on the top of mountains where no one lives because they are transported by the wind. So it's almost impossible. And if you go to these smaller sizes I was talking about, like 10 micrometers, 2 micrometers, well, at this size, it's impossible because removing microplastics would also lead to the removal of organisms from the environment. It would already be in the range of plankton. So it would be very difficult to remove them. I think we need to work on closing the drain up top instead of trying to get them back. Of course, getting some of them back is good anyway.
Mm-hmm. And if you like look at the research, I've been able to see that like the number of microplastics has just been growing and growing like exponentially over the past few years. Like, why do you think that the problem has been like worsening so much each year? Do you think it's like a issue with like waste management, or do you think it's just like the amount of plastic generation has just been far too much for us to handle?
I think it's both, because if we think about it, our grandparents or great grandparents were not used to living with this material. They only had organic or inorganic inert materials like glass or scraps from vegetables. And this was very easy to take care of. They could throw it away, it would have no impact because glass is basically similar to sand. It would break down to be part of the sand. Of course, I'm not saying to litter glass, but I'm just saying. And also the organic matter would degrade naturally. So when we introduced plastics, I think people were not ready to understand they are not degradable. We use plastics because of this. They are very durable, they are very lightweight. And that's why they are very useful for us. But these same properties that make them adventurous also makes them bad for the environment because they also persist in the environment due to these properties. So I think we have a lot to do in terms of waste management. in developed countries, we already have some waste management in place. That does not mean it's the best end of life, because a lot of countries still landfill their plastics. At least incineration to get back some energy, or recycling to get back the material, would be good solutions for closing the loop. Of course, some of the plastics will be very degraded after use, and that way they can only go to incineration. And then we also have countries which have plastics but don't have waste management. In this case, I think we are all interested in not having microplastics and plastics everywhere. So maybe other countries could contribute with technology or funds to improve waste management in these countries, because it's not their fault, and also causing some social injustice, because people should not have to live with that amount of waste in their environment.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it would be possible for us to solve the issue of microplastics?
I think it's very difficult to solve, because, as we said, is multidisciplinary. It takes a lot of work in a lot of fronts. We also have a very strong industry backing plastics. So I think we are in the right way, maybe not fast enough, but we are in the right way to increase recycling, increase the use of recycling plastics, because, you know, recycling plastics is very expensive. They are more expensive when you recycle them than when you produce them from oil. So there is no advantage in using the recycled plastics than the ones freshly produced from oil. So we need to change this so that recycled plastics have some are cheaper or have some advantage to companies, because when we're using recycled, we're also creating jobs at national level. We're reducing emissions like carbon dioxide, and we're improving the environment. These are all benefits that cannot be accounted in terms of money, but are included in the recycled plastics. So I think we're in the right way with the bans of plastics, with the recycling, with the, well, biodegradable is difficult to comment, because there's a lot of variability in biodegradability of biodegradable plastics. But I think we're doing a good effort. We just hope we hope it could be faster.
Mm-hmm. I was actually going to ask you a little bit about biodegradable plastics, but you said they were a bit iffy. Like, what are your thoughts on it as a solution to microplastic?
Well, there are different types. I think we would be best to clarify the meanings. Bio-based plastics, like the ones that are being used to produce Legos, are plastics made from biodegradable sources, but they are still non-degradable plastics, because the final molecule is the same as the other. I don't know if I'm getting the message across.
Mm-hmm.
But what I mean is, it doesn't matter where is the source of microplastic. If you produce polyethylene, it doesn't matter if it came from oil or from plants, because it won't be biodegradable. The problem is the molecule itself. So in terms of bio-based plastics, the advantage is not relying on oil and producing them from carbon neutral sources like plants such as corn or sugarcane. Then we go to degradable plastics. These plastics are degradable, but usually under specific conditions. Because we don't want plastics when they are wrapping our cookies. We don't want the plastics to go bad when they are in our shelf. So they are usually only degradable under certain circumstances. One type of degradable plastics are oxo-degradable plastics. And what they do in these types of plastics is they create very small plastic parts like microplastics, and then have a matrix gluing them together. And the degradable part in oxo-degradable plastics is this matrix that is gluing everything together, and it can quickly degrade in the environment. But what happens is only the matrix is degraded and the microplastics remain because they are the small little plastics.
Mm-hmm.
And in this type, it's even worse because you're just accelerating the production of microplastics. And then we have the biodegradable plastics. These ones are the ones that can degrade into water, minerals, oxygen, into very small molecules, simple molecules, under the influence of organisms. And in this case, it will be very variable between plastics because some of them, or most of them, are only biodegradable under specific conditions. And these conditions are industrial composting conditions. We use compost to produce fertilizers for agriculture, and this is only achieved in a specific temperature. I think it's 50 degrees, if I remember correctly, and specific humidity conditions. So if you throw this biodegradable plastic into your backyard, it won't degrade as well. It only degrades under these conditions. And then more recently, they are developing plastics that indeed degrade if you throw them to your backyard. But this will also have a problem because you cannot package food with them because we want plastics to not degrade and keep the food in the shelves for a very long time. So we will have to apply them to very specific places, for instance, in agriculture, maybe fishing, where it's desirable to have this type of degradation.
Mm-hmm. And so far, like, which of these plastics do you think is the most promising?
I'm not very sure because I don't work a lot with biodegradable plastics. I'm mostly focused on the problem of plastics, but I have colleagues working, and I think they are working with the PLA, a type of biodegradable plastic, which seems okay. But it will also depend on the additives and everything you put besides the plastic itself. So I'm waiting to see if they can develop something that is new and can really degrade in the environment.
Mm-hmm. So back to the issue of microplastics, which is your area of expertise. I know you've already mentioned sort of like how we should improve recycling, or at least like revert to using recycled plastic bags in stores. What do you think are some of the other aspects or areas that people should be focusing on if we want to reduce the amount of microplastics in the ocean?
There are several sources. We have the wastewater source, which is mostly released from cosmetics, and most countries are already banning cosmetics with microplastics. So they have to change, because in cosmetics, microplastics either give consistency or act as an exfoliant to clean the skin. So, but you can use natural exfoliants. So countries are trying to ban these type of applications in cosmetics. Also, the clothes we wear, they are mostly made of synthetic materials, also plastics. So maybe improving the filtration. If we can opt for non-plastic clothing, that would be great. Also improving the retention of fibers in the filters of washing machines and in wastewater treatment plants. It seems they already capture most of the plastics, but the problem is some of them escape, which is a problem. And then we have another problem because the biosolids and sludge that comes out of wastewater treatment plants is often used as a fertilizer. So we are actually picking up all these organic matter and microplastics and putting them back in the environment in agricultural soil. So maybe find a way to, in these types where they are very concentrated, maybe if we could degrade them here using enzymes or organisms that can do this. We already know some of them. And this way we could remove them, at least partially, from entering the environment again. And then also we can opt for non-plastic materials, like you use a reusable bottle, it's better if it's aluminum or glass. And I think it's easy to look at the things we use in everyday life that are made of plastic and can be changed to non-plastic materials.
Mm-hmm. Well, last question for today. Just in general, aside from like specifically microplastics, what do you think are some other problems in the plastic pollution area that people should be working on if we want to actually make a dent and essentially fix our environment?
Another problem with plastics, besides the physical particles they produce, like microplastics, is also the chemicals that are inside plastics. Because plastics, we usually talk like polyethylene, this is the base molecule. Plastics are made by connecting several units, monomers, into bigger strings, chains called, that's why they are polymers. Mm-hmm. But they are not only comprised of this. When we buy plastic, something of plastic like a bottle, they do not only contain the plastic molecule, they also have a lot of additives to give them transparency, lower degradation, all to improve the function of plastics. So these additives, there are many. There are, I don't remember the number, but I think they are above 1,000 that we use, and nobody knows if they are bad or not. We have started to look at this even before microplastics. We found that bisphenol A, do you remember? I don't know if you remember this chemical. Mm-hmm. Bisphenol A is used in plastics, but also in other applications. And it is endocrine disruptor. It means it mimics the hormones in our bodies. And since our hormones work in very low concentrations, a low concentration of the bisphenol A can have an effect in our bodies. So this is also a problem because we don't know which additives are bad, which are good, because most of them have not been tested so far. So this is also a problem we should be looking at. I think the European Union, I'm talking about the European Union because I'm in Europe, but they are looking at trying to classify which of these are harmful, at which concentrations, and then which ones are good, or at least develop new ones which are not so bad for the environment or health.
Yeah, BPA and like all of the chemicals, that's like a whole other problem, which is super interesting, but also really sad because there's just so many aspects of plastic pollution that we still need to get under control. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you today. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me and for sharing some super interesting insights on microplastics.
Thank you, Eileen. It has been a pleasure.